Welcome to the Nicoll Mill at the Connetquot State Park Preserve. Please come in. The mill, from the records that we have, was constructed about 1751. They had in the original mill 2 tub wheels, which are horizontal wheels, and these wheels drove the stones that you see above them. Primarily grains such as corn and wheat, possibly millet, oats. The work that you see in what we've done here, after the majority of the mill was destroyed, is to recreate as close as we can from what we did have remaining and from some of the old records and pictures. Mill had been severely destroyed with powder post beetle and carpenter ants. The equipment that you see in the mill today, much of that was lost. The pieces that do remain are things such as the pieces of tentering shaft, tentering rods, the old elevator that carried the grain up to the upper floors, the bolters which were used for sifting the flour that afterwards the grist was ground, and the control shafts so that would be used to control the flow of the water through the mill. The mill was originally built on dry land. The various washouts over the years caused severe damage to some of the footings. Parts of the mill would be washed away, and at some point a third shaft was added. Now this shaft was used, we suspect, primarily as a sawmill. That too has disappeared, and we have no records of that, but that was what they believe. This shaft, in later years during the 1800s, was extended to go up to the 3rd floor, or attic, and where it drove additional machinery which became part of the automation and mechanisms of the 1800s. During the 1800s, we have the Southside Sportsman Club in 1866 bought the property. This property had been popular with wealthy sportsmen from New York City. They used to come on out to the tavern and live there. In 1866, they bought all this property, and they maintained that for about 10 years. After about that period of time, they got tired of the heavy traffic running in front of their clubhouse and donated and then built the bridge down on Montauk Highway so they could turn this into a private road and isolate themselves from the traffic. At the same time, with the changes in this road, a new sluice way was put in, a small dam was down below, and Lower Pond was formed. A couple of the things that happened as a result of this is the water flow was impacted on the mill, and it was not getting the power that they had. About 3 years later, 1879, the mill closed. If you'd like to take a trip up to the stone room, I'll give you an idea of what the flow of the grist and grain was. We call this the stone room, for obvious reasons that we have the millstones on this level. These stones, such as the one on the left, gives you the more detail because it's uncovered. These are French burr stones. The stones are individual segments imported from France, arrive over here, become cemented together, banded, and plastered. These stones, the top stone, which is called the runner stone, weighs approximately 1,500 pounds. Then there's the bottom stone, which is the bed stone, and that stays put. The top stone has a small arch of cast iron in the middle called a rind, and on that's what pivots it from the shaft. It's balanced on there from the shaft that goes down to the wheel below. Now, typically, the grain would arrive out from what was Montauk Highway. That grain would come on in, be received by the miller. The miller would bring it in and weigh it. The weight was an important part of this process, as the miller got 8 to 10% of the weight of the grain as his fee for the processing. After the grain was weighed in, it would then be hoisted up to the top level or attic, where it would undergo a cleaning process. Now, the item up there is called, in slang, a smutter. It's actually a fanning mill, and the purpose of this is wheat has a fungus that grows on it called smut. It's a very sticky fungus, and what they can do is putting it through this fanning mill, majority of that is blown out. This fanning mill, in addition to that, is able to separate out certain seeds from weeds and other materials that are not grain. It knows if it's too large, too small, too heavy, too light, and it blows that chaff or whatever out the exhaust chute outside. Now, usually that was out to feed the fish. It was something else that they could nibble on. The balance of the clean grain then came on down, fell through the chutes into this garner up top, and the garner would hold the grain until it was ready to be released into one of the hoppers above the millstone. It was then fed into this hopper, and when we had a measure in there, the miller could control the release of that through a small gate. It would flow down through the bottom of the hopper into the shoe down below. Now this shoe is being wrapped by something called a damsel. The damsel is, in this case, a 4-beat damsel. They make 3s and they make other styles as well. That was controlled by the crook string, that fine string that goes down below. So when the miller had the down below watching to see how the grist was coming out, the grain went in, the grist comes out, he could adjust the twist peg and the crook string to control how fast it was being wrapped. We don't hear that sound on this right now, as I have it running at a very low speed for safety. Typically, that stone would be turning at over 100 revolutions per minute, and there would be a real staccato sound of that coming through. When that was finished and being ground into the grist, it would go down the grist chute to the grist bin below. From the grist bin, it would fall into a grist elevator. Here on the bolter or drying floor, we have the upper part of that grist elevator. That elevator brings the grist up. It is dumped into a bolter. This bolter is a bolter cabinet, and inside of it is a bolter reel. The reel is typically 4-sided, and it's wrapped in different grades or fineness of cloth. It's almost like a silk stocking on the upper end. It gets coarser or more open weave down below. The very finest flour would come out at this end. Generally, that is called flour. Then you had middlings. Middlings weren't quite as well or as finely ground. And then you would have bran would make it out to the very end. Bran generally went home with the farmer to help feed his livestock. The middlings were frequently captured and saved, and they would be held briefly until the farmer had more grain, or if they wanted to remix it with additional grain, and they could try to regrind that for an additional yield. The fine flour came on out, and that went on home with the percentage from the miller's take. On this point, we see the south shaft as it goes up to the upper level. Originally, the south shaft ended where we're standing. In later years, it was extended and brought all the way up to the attic to help power additional machinery. There are other implements around here, additional garners and hoppers. You see the cover or the ton for the uncovered wheels down on the stone floor. There's a capstan. This capstan normally would be down on the main floor, and this controls the water flow for the south shaft. Now, over on this corner, we have what is the reel that would fit inside of a bolter that was used for cornmeal. You can see this is not like a fine cloth, it's much coarser, and this would be fine, the kernel, unground corn obviously coming out of the more open grain that you have. So that would be for cornmeal. Well, we come back down to the stone level. I'd like to point out a few things that we passed as we went into the flow of the grain through a grist mill. The first of these things is these stones, which had to be sharpened periodically. Top stone weighing approximately 1,500 pounds. Be able to move this, lift it up, invert it so they could sharpen the groove in the runner stone. That was done through the use of this crane. The crane held a bale. The bale is out of cast iron or forged steel, really, I guess you could have to say, and this was capable of lifting up and supporting this bale, the stone. On this side, we don't have the bale on there, but what I can show you is that once he picked it up, they would then swing it out so they could do their work on it, swing it back, and set it back on top again. So none of this material was here other than this one crane when we started the renovation. So we've had to go and do some research, visit other mills, and make replicas of what we have found. Another items, or two items on this floor that I'd like to point out. One is the corn sheller. This was a machine that would typically be found on a farm, and it's a very labor-intensive, push the dried ear of corn in to get the kernels to bring to the miller. So very labor-intensive. This machine over here is a smudder, and this too does all of the work, but this would be found only on a farm. This smudder would do the cleaning process, again, extremely labor-intensive, which is one of the reasons why the miller thrived. There were over 100 mills on Long Island at one time. The farming community depended upon them to process all the flour that they had. Unfortunately, for the local miller, as the Industrial Revolution progressed and then more and more automation came in other areas, it was very hard to maintain a building of this size, particularly if you had to wash out to reconstruct this and try to get the new materials, whereas they could have it processed. Transportation became much more prevalent. You could move grain greater distances. Typically, a miller depended upon farmers within 10 miles from where he lived. Reason being, load your grain onto a horse and cart. You have to take it to the miller. The miller has to process it, and you have to come home, and you want to do that in one day. This does limit the range and explains why there were so many mills on Long Island. Well, back down on the main floor, you can still hear the water splashing from the sluiceway, and this is controlled by a gate. The gate can cut off the supply of the water or increase the supply of water depending upon how fast the miller wanted the wheel to turn. We explained earlier about how you had the crook string and the twist peg. These adjusted the wrapping of the damsel on the shoe and control the flow of the grist so it did how fast the grain was being released. We have a tentering shaft. This tentering shaft controlled a tentering rod. The tentering rod hooked up to a bridge beam. The bridge beam enabled the shaft to be lifted and lowered very slightly. Now the top of that shaft is the runner stone, is being balanced. So when you think you got 1,500 pounds of runner stone, the mechanical advantages of all these beams meant that he could control this bottle weight, oak filled with lead, gave him the stability to hold the particular position and the balance so he could test the fineness of the grist coming out. Grist would fall into the grist bin. From the grist bin, it would then fall into the grist elevator. And if you look, you can see the cups on this. Now this grist elevator is different from the one that I showed you on the other wall. That one is one of the original ones. It has a calf's skin, it's a leather belt with wooden blocks that used to raise the grist. This one is later. This is the mid-1800s. This one is, they started using formed metal cups. And finally, the actual machine that you see here was built in the early 1900s, 1927, I believe, March 1927. This particular one was made, and it was donated by some people up in the upstate New York, from the Society for the Preservation of Old Mills. When I talk about people and donations, much of what you see here today is because of the generosity and hard work of a number of people. The mill was getting pretty sad. It was leaning severely into the tail. The foundations had all gone. And the Friends of Connetquot started a campaign to raise the permits and the funding to bring it back. They got cables around underneath this, lifted it up, built the coffer dam, and then began all new foundations. There was some archaeological work done to try to learn what was under the ground that we couldn't see that might be help in understanding what was happening. But the Friends of Connetquot were the ones who made it all possible. The real work began in about 2006, and in 2017, they finally had the final little pieces were being put into place. The last of the shingles being put on the side, and the installation of the actual wheel that water wheel that we have down below. We've had some minor work done since then to try to make sure everything moves, to try to give a better understanding of what it probably was like at the time that this mill was running. Hence the addition of an operating grist elevator. No, we don't want to touch the old one. The old leather and oak and things like that show us what it was like back when they really had to work to get these things to work. We've added a few other things that were more timely, tool chests and things like that, so we can understand and hopefully appreciate what we are should be so grateful for today. I hope that has given you some sort of an idea as to what we've got here. The work will continue. There are plenty of opportunities to demonstrate more of what goes on, such as with the south shaft. We have that so it's turning free now. There are different gears overhead which operated other pieces of machinery, and we hope to get more of them going.